Just to begin on a rather personal note, but then right into the panel discussion, a couple years ago, I and three of my very academic colleagues, awed by the Indian commercial rate of growth, 8%, 8.5%, 9%, went to India, talked with many of the leaders of Indian business. I think you all know the names of people like K.V. Kamath at ICICI and so on. Working with the academic premise, totally false as it turns out, that many Indian business leaders today had come to the US or UK or maybe elsewhere in Europe for their MBA education or maybe their undergraduate training, took those ideas back. They knew all about Peter Drucker and Jack Welch, but they applied it better in India than managers were doing so in the US. So our comeuppance, we discovered that that was a completely false expectation, is that they took Peter Drucker back and Jim Collins and Jack Welch and created their own India way of leading, India way of managing. And we conclude our book by saying the miracle of the rate of growth of Indian industry, some companies represented in this room, year on year, 15, 20, 30% annual growth, is in part because of a distinctive Indian way of leading and managing that the US, Western Europe, ought to pay attention to. We can learn a lot from. Second personal note as follows. I've been coming to this particular town for a while, and I can't remember the last time, and maybe ever, that there has been a session, a dialogue, for thinking about what Africa can learn from India and India can learn from Africa. So compliments to the chefs here, IBEF, the Ministry of External Affairs, and Ideas Works for doing something that needs to be done, because as a McKinsey study of some time ago concluded, it's obvious as soon as I say it, we learn a lot more from people outside our own world than from people inside our own world. So our panel today, picking up on the comments that have already been made, is going to think about this collectively. What can Africa draw upon from the Indian experience and vice versa, not only in the larger company terrain, but also for entrepreneurship, singular. Jesandra Naicker is CEO of Biotherm Energy. She informed me they no longer do the bio piece, but they are involved in wind and solar power creation. I also learned that, based in South Africa, that she studied medicine and finance in her college day, her university's days, but now she's making power. Bright Simmons, who studied physics, by the way, in his university days, is president of M Pedigree Network in Ghana. He's also a young global leader, by the way, as is Jesandra. Neelam Chiver is founder of Industry India. She's a WEF Social Entrepreneur for the Year. She'll tell us a little bit more about her company as we get going. And in her university days, she was an industrial designer. I think if we ask everybody in this room a little bit about their past, we're not exactly what we were in those days, but that's, I think, symptomatic of how we move towards opportunities which may not be reflective or directly a product of what we had aspired to be at age 18. I'm going to start now, and Dr. Moyo is part of our panel as well. No special order here. I'd like just throw it out at us. In thinking about what India can learn from Africa, and Africa in all of its complexity can learn from India's complexity, to learn, you have to have some common ground. So what's the common element that leads Indians to look to Africa and Africans to look to India? What's the common platform? Jesandra, go ahead.
So let me kick off. Good afternoon, everybody. I think there's a lot of commonality between Africa and India. We both have rapidly growing economies, on average above 5% per annum. I think that says a lot in terms of how fast we're actually growing. We have many young consumers. If we look at if you look at the population of both regions, the majority of them are very young people. And over time, you're definitely going to see potentially higher disposable income coming out of this generation. There's also rapid urbanization. We've got a growing middle class with strong aspirations. Our cities are growing at an enormously fast rate, both in India and in Africa. And the other interesting thing is that most urban households have two breadwinners. So, what does that really mean? We've got a desire to focus on convenience foods. The other thing that we are seeing is a high level of entrepreneurship coming out from both of those regions as well.
Great, super.
Wonderful. You've said so much, Cassandra. I feel the two continents, I think India is a continent on its own in a lot of ways. I like to look at India and Africa and to say that they are the cusp of reforms. So for many, many, many decades, almost every African country was similar to India as far as the command and control economy was concerned. I can mention with the possible exception of maybe Cote d'Ivoire or one or two countries. Every country in Africa took on the command and control approach to economics. Even though we were not as successful as some of the Asian countries in the way that we went about it, in terms of our technocratic capacity to execute that command and control economy, India and African countries have typically now, or over the past 2 decades, been embarked on reforms to become market-oriented economies. And the challenges and the throwbacks and the tensions between these market reforms and the way that our economies have been run for the past 4 decades give rise to amazing similarities in the challenges that confront our governance. Our bureaucracies and our attempts to reform our bureaucracies are immensely identical. I think also when you look at mass spirituality, that is an important element of, and not just spirituality, but also the communality of Indian and African societies. The fact that the extended family remains as a vestige in only those two continents, and perhaps the Middle East. But I think the Middle East is part of Africa nowadays. So, with the exception of those two continents, if you look at China, you look at much of the global north, the family as a unit has become a nuclear unit. How does that translate into the way societies are organized? These are all very formidable examples.
Super. Neil, you want to take a stab?
Yeah, I just focus on one point, I think, which the two of them haven't touched upon, is that I was talking to a gentleman yesterday who was saying that in villages, maybe 100 kilometers from Bangalore, which is the IT capital of the world, we have first-generation kids going to school, meaning their parents were farmers who have never seen the inside of school, people who are completely in what would be the past, and people who are being pushed completely into the future, with a big thrust. And a society which has to handle both these angles as best as possible.
Super. Ekasana.
Well, I think the only thing I would add is, I'm not sure whether maybe just it was mentioned, I didn't hear it. Clearly, Africa and India share a colonial sort of, from the other end, experience. And I think our reactions to that history is not the same. And therefore, there is maybe lessons and comparisons to be made in learning from each other. And I would dare to suggest that I think a lot of African countries are still going through a rebellion mode in spite of being independent, if you see what I mean. Whereas I get the impression that India has reconciled itself to that history much more healthily and is able to build on it, as opposed to continue to rebel against that history, which is a fact.
Since you have, I think, in all cases, I think I've got this right, traveled in the other country area from which you were raised, help us understand one thing that you have learned if you're from Africa and India, or if you're from India and you've traveled to Kenya or Nigeria or Ivory Coast. Who would like to start on that? Something you've brought home because the similarities are there, you can look at it, but because the difference is evident, you can learn from it. So go ahead.
I can go first. No, my take on the whole Africa-India thing is that Africa is definitely going to leapfrog. Africa is going to... So I take that whole leapfrogging... let's not just go down the garden path the way everybody else has, the way all the economies have. And I think they're doing that, yeah? So they're getting into the digital age much faster. 50% of the financial economy of Kenya is done on M-Pesa. And stuff like that. So I take that newness, and I think as a nation, they are actually poised to be far more creative than India, because India is an evolved economy. So we have a lot of the money and the decision-making powers lying in the hands of people who don't necessarily give creativity a lot of Whereas they can bypass all of that. They can straight away move into an era of innovation, creativity, energy. So I take that from Africa.
Great. Right.
In my view, it's very clear what India has done to my own concepts and my own notions of entrepreneurship. Frugal innovation is the phrase that I'll use. I'm always amazed about the frugality of the Indian business machine. I source most of my labels because the easiest way to implement my model is to use secondary labels on the packaging. I actually have it here and I'll show it. And I source most of those in India. And the cost dynamics compared to Europe is unbelievable. I don't know how they make it. So frugal innovation is certainly the thing that I take from there. But the other thing, what it's led to is legitimize my understanding of both social entrepreneurship as an efficient way of doing business and the whole notion of the global SME. And you're going to hear more of this going forward. We are now at a stage where companies that earn less than $1 million and employ less than 50 people can operate globally. But you won't know that unless you are in India or you're in Africa. Because the ability to operate within tight constraints and to innovate constantly within those constraints, in my view, are almost a uniquely Indian African. Even the Chinese don't compare when it comes to that level of frugality.
Yep. Ektasana.
I'm going to digress a little bit and maybe tell you a bit about what I'm doing. Minds. Minds is, as you heard, Mandela Institute for Development Studies. And I'll come back to why I think India has got something more to teach Africa than the other way around in this particular dimension. It intrigues me. I'm almost at the end of my working life. I'm over 60, retired and all of that. And I am puzzled by what appears to be a lack of a sense of ownership by us Africans of our own issues. I think I would be pretty close to being correct if I say we are the only continent which, in my mind, is attempting to develop itself using a completely foreign framework. All our institutions are completely foreign. The framework is foreign. When I look at India, even if you use the example of Bollywood, because the arts are actually quite telling in terms of how a people are comfortable with who they are, where they've come from, what journey they've traveled. That tells their story. So I think two things arise from this. Firstly, it would appear that African professionals are not very good managers. And that, for me, is like there is a symptom whose roots I would like to understand. Second observation. Africa exhibits an unbelievably low level of compliance with anything that is institutional. Yeah? And I think the reason, my hypothesis is that the reason is because we are trying to run a system which is completely alien from anything that is us. Come the point of independence, although we fought against the colonizer, what actually happened? We just adopted the same frameworks and attempted to run them, as opposed to reconfiguring them. Yeah, that's what we did. And I think part of the challenge which we are facing in terms of development, why we're not doing so well, is precisely because we're trying to manipulate instruments that we don't understand. That's my view. So my learning would be, I think I'm impressed by how Indians appear to be comfortable with their own history. And they build on that. And if I may go further afield, if you look at Japan, look at China, because some of my friends say to me, but Nkosana, what are you trying to say? Are you trying to say we should go primitive and stay there? And that's not what I'm saying. You see, if you go to Japan, the Japanese have gone out into the world and learnt from the world and copied from the world, technical and what have you. They've come back. You cannot doubt what the platform is. It is Japanese. So the learning and staying yourself is not a contradiction. You have to learn to smartly reconcile the two. And I think once you do that, you are using a platform which not only your technocrats can manage and be competent, but the bulk of your population can identify with and participate in the development effort. And I think part of our struggle in Africa is that we've left the bulk of our people behind because they don't identify with the institutions that we put in place. I think India can teach us something in this.
Cassandra.
So I'm a very fortunate person because my parents are Indian. On my mom's side, I'm first generation South African, and on my father's side, second. But I am South African as well, and I feel I've been able to have a foot in both regions. And I've gone back to India quite a few times, and I have to say that what I really believe is an advantage from an Indian perspective is the Nike attitude, the just do it attitude. No matter where you are, and no matter how rural certain areas are, there's that ability to come up with an idea and then implement it. I feel from our perspective, sitting on the African side of it, we talk a lot, but we find implementation to be the hardest aspect of finding solutions. And I think that's one thing that we can really learn from. We get quite concerned about our risks. We put up walls to say, oh, this will be difficult, that will be difficult. But you see solutions coming out of India and you go, wow, I know that can be applied in my region. But you've taken it and you've just said, I'll do it, I'll test it, I'm willing to fail, but at the same time, I could actually succeed.
Let me pick up on that with two quick questions, and then we're going to open it up. Toyota, I think you all know, we all know, has long been a kind of world standard when it comes to auto manufacturing. What they've often called the lean production or flexible manufacturing method has been a world standard. In my MBA classes, I used to bring in a General Motors senior manager to talk about what they have learned from Toyota. In that maybe it's lost to history now, GM and Toyota ran a joint venture for automaking in California for 20 years. The agenda for General Motors was to learn from Toyota, just like Africa can learn from India and vice versa. The senior manager from General Motors came into my class, I think 3 years running, ran manufacturing, spent a year at the joint venture, said it's unbelievably difficult. He said, I'd walk out of the Toyota lean manufacturing system. I think you know the deal there. All buffers are waste. If you got a problem, you stop the line. And he says he just could not easily bring that back. Now, 20 years later, General Motors has adopted and understands finally. So let's see. Here's my question. As you look across a certain ocean here, talk about how to facilitate, if you wouldn't mind, that cross-continental learning. And I'm going to offer the answer that all of you were thinking of, that the best way to do that is to come to Davos. And the second best way, or maybe the first best way, is to attend this session. But beyond that, how do you help cross-continental learning of innovation or issues of rule of law as we've had? Who would like to pick up on that and get us going? How are you going to do it years ahead? Cassandra, you want to go with that one?
Sure. Last August, I had the opportunity to spend 10 days in Hyderabad at the India School of Business. And the week was all about what could we learn from the India example and how India is developing. We had a full, very rich 5 days of business case studies, interaction with leaders in terms of how they've overcome challenges. And I think that was probably for me the best learning I could have, the interaction with business in India and understanding their challenges and them willing to share what worked, what didn't, and taking that and trying to adapt it to the African region.
So hang on to that. Great point. So point number one, Bright, you've got additional learning methods for transferring good ideas and best practices?
I feel governments can do a lot. To date, the government-to-government relationship has not been oriented towards a facilitation of links between peoples. It's still been very much government leader to government leader. Whereas I think government to government can be about creating a bridge between the two peoples. And I don't see the African governments in particular, but also the Indian government to an extent, working towards that facilitation of links between people, which is why I commend Amit and IdeaWorks and the team at IdeaWorks, what they're trying to do, to bridge the people.
Totally.
I think once the people are bridged, we're going to see a lot more business interactions. And some of these business interactions have the capacity to change the supply chain between India and Africa in ways that are fascinating.
Yep. Good. Neelam.
I would take the third.
Good. The third way.
Big player in this, which would be civil society. Yeah, yeah, because I mean, I actually spent time in Africa thanks to a program actually funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and an organization called Leaders Quest. And we were reviewing a program called Poverty Reduction Through Digital Employment, PRIDE. And through the whole thing, I kept telling the people from Rockefeller, why are you looking at poverty reduction in Africa through digital employment? And you know, so civil society is could learn a lot from the whole Africa-India thing and work and look at better ways of moving overall government policy, business policy, because they have played a role in this sector for a long time.
3 ways, and Nkosana, a 4th way?
I'm afraid I've got no 4th way. I will just reinforce Jasandra's way. In all my life, I've traveled a lot, and I've found that going there and seeing is the best way.
Yep. I'm going to personalize that and then open it up. I've read all about India. I've been there many times. I learned more about India at age 10 from going with my family for the better part of a year to live initially Churchgate Station and then Bombay, and then we lived in Corrigan Park, Pune. Nothing like being there to really appreciate it. So let's open it up.
Actually, I'm hoping that a day will come soon when an innovation born in Africa is first scaled up in India.
Yeah, great point.
Similarly, an innovation born in India is first scaled up in Brazil. An innovation born in Brazil first scaled up in Africa. Something like that. So I think that does something. Often an innovation within a domestic environment faces hurdles. The domestic environment doesn't realize sometimes the importance of an innovation under their nose.
The core of our operation is mainly Nigeria, India. So a lot of the Indian manufacturers of medicines that are sending medicines into Africa, particularly to Nigeria, use our technology to comply with government regulations. So those engines are there, but as you rightly pointed out, it's a scaling mechanism that to date has evaded a lot of these innovative links.
Super. Let's go back out. Next question.
I don't think it's a question. I think it's more a comment, and I'd like the panel to kind of help me understand this better. So I've been to a lot of countries in Africa, traveled a lot in India, and very recently, I think over the last year, as a maternal health expert, trying to help both the countries identify innovations. Both the countries, when we go visit and ask them questions, they like to show us that everything is right, though nothing is right, right? And I feel like it takes a lot of asking and a lot of making them understand to actually come up with the truth. And I feel like the more we as Indians and Africans can stop pretending that everything is going right and start believing that we have a few things that we have to change and we need help to change. And I wonder why that happens. I think we are so hesitant in asking for help. We're so hesitant in saying, yes, this is wrong and we want it. And I don't know if everybody agrees with me or it might be just me thinking that way.
You know, I sit here at Davos and listen to certain sessions where I walk away thinking, what a waste of time. Precisely because what you just described happens all the time, but I understand what's behind it. There is a cultural issue. You know the English expression, washing dirty laundry, washing your dirty laundry in public? There is a very strong cultural element in Africans that you don't do that. It doesn't mean there is nothing wrong or they're not aware of it. The setting is wrong for them to tell you. That's all. You have to find a different setting.
Yep.
Because there isn't, you talk about change, somebody was talking about change management when we began, the notion is very often to let things stay the way they are. I mean, the notion of the raison d'etre of a public bureaucracy is not to help you to innovate. Mm-hmm. So if you go to a public hospital and you want to talk to the CEO of a public hospital and you want him to admit that their systems are completely ridiculous, admitting that means work. And typically people don't want to work as hard as you might want them to. I think you get more if you are dealing with social entrepreneurs within those organizations. And the challenge is that we've not identified social entrepreneurship as a profession in its own category within the public and private sector to create a link between public sector social entrepreneurs and private sector public social entrepreneurs. That's a challenge. How do we create that recognition that within the public sector there are social entrepreneurs and within the private sector there are social entrepreneurs, and the two can force change? Because leaving it to the traditional entrepreneurs and the traditional bureaucrats will lead to no change.
Gilliam?
there's this word glocalization, which is going round and round in my head.
Yeah.
And he mentioned Bollywood. And I feel that, the cultural industries and the creativity, which is so common within India and Africa. I mean, I was amazed to know that in a creative industries report, global report by UNCTAD, the largest contribution to Jamaica's GDP via export has been reggae. 40%. 40%. I mean, you look at the US, the entire rap industry, it's built on African, DNA.
Yeah.
So there is so much in the entertainment and the creative industries and the cultural industries sector. So I go back to what he said, that maybe everybody is focusing on the wrong things sometimes in Africa, Because this statistics on Jamaica never leaves my... I couldn't believe it when I read that report.
Yeah.
Cassandra.
I mean, this initiative, the India Brand Equity Fund and the India-Africa movement, what was very interesting to see was some of the activities you have done in terms of culture, the drawing competitions, the cross-cultural competitions around that, which never, it's... I can tell you, I haven't seen many of those in my own country, but to see it being sponsored by an Indian organization and focusing on Africa, I thought was a good thing because we never get that opportunity. But coming back to Zubaira's point, I think we don't like talking about our failures. And they could be as apparent as they are. I mean, I look at education, and it's my big bugbear because in the definition of a pass now in my country, it's moved to 30%. And as far as I'm concerned, anything below 60 should be a fail. So, and it's just like they've changed the parameters in terms of saying this is still successful. And it's very hard to get, especially government organizations and public service bodies to admit to, hey, I failed. It shows bad performance on my side. And I think it's actually up to civil society and the private sector to take it upon themselves to say, I'm implementing this initiative. I look at the rural education programs that we see sometimes in India, and I just think, wow, that would be fantastic if we could even deploy it in one village in Africa.
We've got a question here, and just fair warning, in about 5 minutes, we're going to ask you to sum up.
It goes back to what both
Comment.
of you say. It's a comment that if you ask, whether they failed or not, I think if you add on immediately the question, and what's the learning out of it?
Right.
And what can I learn, or what can we learn from that experience? They're much more willing to give you action. They're quite happy because they actually made it most likely afterwards.
Okay.
And so this is the way to go.
It's a great point. Let me put my words on it, but back to you. It's what the armed forces all over the world refer to as the after-action review. What do we do right? What do we do wrong? What can we do better differently? So let me actually throw that to the panel. This is a little bit of a, as we would say, American baseball, yet again, a bit of a curveball, unexpected. Can you pick out something that you have learned to do differently in your entrepreneurial careers or otherwise? And maybe it's an internal learning. Maybe you've looked across the ocean there to see how it's done in a different country or continent. But does anybody want to grab that one, or I'll give you a pass if you prefer? Sandra, you want to take that one? Yeah. Good.
I'm happy to do that. Prior to moving back to South Africa, I worked in the US for some time, and it was very much a go, go, go. If this is your objective, you're going to try to do it by yesterday. And moving back into my current environment, and as I work particularly in the energy space and who I interact with from a stakeholder perspective, I realized that strategy doesn't really work. It can't actually be adopted across the ocean. And I need to adapt to what I do and how I do it based on my local environment. So as much as we talk about global opportunities and commonalities, we also need to adapt to that local environment.
There are universal values in business. I think trust, communication, they will pop up anywhere. Mm-hmm. So the fact that, yes, you want a trusting partner, the fact that you have an open communication line is important. But, remembering that somebody has a family, or remembering that, in some cultures, Friday is, even though they may come to business because it's a Western business setting, they expect you to give them some slack on Friday, is helpful. And I think, the event is there, the substance is there, but the process is also important. So you want to build trust, the important things of keeping your word and those things are essential, but the process by which you go on that joint journey to that trusting relationship is just as important.
Yep.
And I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to that process.
I would say in my entrepreneurial career, the biggest takeaway I got from my trips to Africa, I actually sometimes don't see that level of genuineness in India anymore that I saw in Africa. I don't know.
Yep.
You know?
Good. Thanks, I don't want to swing at that one.
In a very short phrase, listening to people who disagree with me.
We've all learned to be better at that. Let's begin to bring it to a close as follows. For me, the last half an hour was worth the price of admission, which meant a lot of travel to get to Davos. So, fantastic dialogue. We've got 3 sponsors that have made this particular dialogue possible, so thank you to them. The real payoff, though, of this last 45 minutes or an hour, really, is to make certain we got a couple of points that we're going to walk out of here with and do something with as we return to our home country. So, no particular order, just let the spirit move you. If you want people to walk out of this door in just a couple minutes now and remember this panel for the content of it, what would you single out? And you can take 15, 20 seconds just sitting there if you like before somebody wants to answer. And I'd like you all to be answering the same question.
No, I would say look at Africa's creative energy. I think it's a hugely creative nation. They are far more in touch with nature than any other civilization on the planet today. And there has to be something going forward for that in the future. They are far more in touch with themselves and with their own creativity. And if we can unleash that in some ways, I would think that is something Africa has that the rest of the globe actually doesn't. I don't know how that gets channelized effectively, but
Got to work on that.
yeah.
I would say that for me, I think there should be greater collaboration between India and Africa. I think there's a huge opportunity set. And if I just look at my industry, and I'm collectively referring to it as the power sector, if we look at the growth needs and of India and the natural resource surplus we have in Africa, I see an opportunity just from that.
I would say if we can do it and raise resources for it, encourage 2 activities. Tourism and education between the 2 sectors, continents. Yeah.
I think everybody should walk out of here with one phrase in mind, and that is the phrase that I mentioned earlier, the notion of the global SME. I think the notion of the global SME is going to change business and change it completely. And Africa and India will provide some of the most amazing examples of small companies that manage to develop a global footprint.
Let me take that question. This is a little bit unexpected. I'd like 1 or 2 of you to add your own thought from this.
I live in a village where a lot of African students live. And I think they face a lot of discrimination day to day, racial discrimination, which you would not expect from a country like India. So if we want them to be ambassadors for this relationship, we have to look at ourselves and see how we treat our African guests.
Well put.
It's just to add on to the conversation here, and this, my experiences about Africa has really come from a thorough understanding. Well, I took a trip from the southernmost point in South Africa, and I made my way all the way up. And what I often learned or came to realize is that there's this misconception that Africa is one nation or it's one land. And I want to break that. And within Africa, as much as we're unified in a lot of our experiences, we're also separated by a diverse culture. There's a diverse number of people that we all need to really understand before we can start saying, how do we improve Africa? How do we do business in Africa? Thank you.
So to pull it together and bring it to a close, I went to a session last night, and maybe a few of you were there. Heads of state from Latin countries and ministers were the sort of the featured people in the room. Several Latin presidents. The moderator made the point that the world does not quite appreciate, certainly the Western European and North American world, that Latin America is on a tear. 4.5%, 5.5%, 6% annual year-on-year GDP growth. I think the world equally doesn't quite appreciate that Africa is on a tear. I think a lot of the world knows that India, like China, has had great growth in recent years. But that's a way of saying that and Ms. Lagarde said as much in her comments on the opening day, that while Europe and North America are stuck with our current problems, growth of maybe 1.5%, maybe 2% forecast at best next couple of years, future growth is going to come out of India and Africa and Latin America. And what does it mean to grow? Well, we've heard from our three amazing entrepreneurs today that so much of that growth obviously is going to come out of new ideas addressing new concerns, new customer needs. It's also going to come out of thinking about and looking for really good ideas and best practices wherever they are. And since you all said a lot of your similarities across the ocean are not different, it seems like you got a lot to learn from each other. So with that, I'm going to actually, this is an odd way to end. As you make your way out, I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Amit here. Would you make an effort just to come and have a handshake, and now to join me in thanking our panel for a great presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mike, for moderating this excellent session. And thank you very much, presenters. And I would ask my partner, Sudhir Horo. It is essentially, he's a designer by training. I am the bullshitter in the partnership. And it was his call at about 2 o'clock one late night that set us working on this idea. We went to the Ministry of External Affairs, Mrs. Das's predecessor, Mr. Suri, who is now India's ambassador to Egypt. We went to him with the idea and said, this is what we want to do across Africa. Will you support us? He said, well, the idea sounds and smells good. If you can come back to me with a plan in 48 hours, I'll put it up to the government for funding. That's precisely what we managed to do. And 3 weeks later, we had the funding. So I would just want to call Horo out here and ask him to share a few words with you.
Each of us, when we are growing up, we have our own dreams. Now, the point is, how many of us can actually make a career out of this? Whether you're an artist, you're a painter, you're a musician, there is an entrepreneurship role there where you can sustain yourself as well as your community. And that is where we thought, where the average age of Indians and Africans are less than 25 years. If we can manage to guide them towards this path, the future is going to be bright, or else 50% of this population is going to make the lives of rest of the world miserable. So that's how India-Africa Shared Future came about. Thank you everyone for coming and supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thank you all for your sharing your thoughts, sharing your experiences with us. India and Africa have a close bilateral relationship. We've got an economic relationship. India has, you mentioned about the colonial past, India has been has supported Africa throughout its period of difficulties. Close historical relationship which got a greater boost with the India-Africa Summit partnership, which grew over since 2008 when we had the first summit. The second summit was held in Addis Ababa in 2011. And after the Addis Ababa summit, during that time, it was felt that going beyond governments, we needed to talk to the people. We needed to bring Indian and Africans together. And this is a program which is really aimed at young people, to get their creativity growing, to get them to think about each other, to get them to connect with each other. So India-Africa Shared Future is really a public diplomacy initiative aimed at the people of India and Africa, the young in India and Africa, to connect with each other, to think with each other. And I think we've had a wonderful year and a half, a little more than a year. There have been lots of competitions. You mentioned about the poster competition, the a lot of other competitions, but the business venture competition has really thrown up these very bright young people, and we are absolutely delighted that we were able to bring them to Davos and bring India-Africa Shared Future to Davos. And thank you all once again, and I hope to see the India-Africa Shared Future grow further. Thank you.